Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. You know, today is a time when protecting children and it just kind of feels like an uphill battle. It's not like a normal thing anymore. Well, Wyoming recently just delivered two major wins. They've passed laws shielding children from harmful online content, as well as ensuring fairness in sports by ensuring that girls aren't forced to compete against biological males. So today we have joining us to talk about this is Joseph Kohm. He's the Director of Public Policy at Family Policy Alliance, where he helps craft and advocate for pro-family legislation across the nation. He's led major initiatives like Help Not Harm, Save Girls Sports, Let Parents Parent, and he regularly testifies before state legislators. He hosts the House to Home podcast. He equips families to stay engaged in the fight for faith, family, and freedom. So, Joseph, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Peter. It's an honor to be here. I'm excited for what we're going to talk about.
So I'm just going to kind of start kind of like looking at things from kind of the other side of things. So some people say that when you're talking about regulating online content, there's the balance of the First Amendment. And I know there's always kind of that carved out exception of pornography, which is community standards. But now it doesn't seem like there is a community standard when it comes to pornography. So how do you balance that, these protections of children with free speech rights? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Peter, because you're absolutely right about the Supreme Court's historic jurisprudence and that it has protected, I would say, unfortunately, has protected adult rights to access pornography for several generations now, since about the 50s or the 60s. And that's always been a challenge to what we would call social conservatives or pro-family advocates who know kind of inherently that this is bad for children. And they've tried to fight it in different ways, and it's always been struck down by the court under this First Amendment exception, not because kids have a right to access this, but because they were ruled supposedly as infringements upon adults' rights to access. And then this great piece of technology came around called age verification technology. And I want to just get out in front of your audience right out the gate. This is not like if you browse onto a liquor store website or something like that and you just self-attest to your age. That is not what I'm talking about. Now, through the growth of technology, which is inherently a moral neutral technology generally, through the growth of technology, we can independently verify a user's age safely, securely, and privately. And so a couple of years ago, a great state representative in Louisiana named Lori Schlegel decided to apply this to online pornography to protect kids because she was a sex therapist and she had joined the Louisiana House of Representatives. And she knew from her practice that this is bad for people overall, but especially for kids. And she got the first one of these laws passed. And now there's 21. I'm happy to say that Wyoming is the 21st state to pass it. And so when we balanced that right, what we went back and did is we looked at old Supreme Court jurisprudence. And there is a caveat to that jurisprudence that protects First Amendment adult rights to access pornography in a case called Griswold. I'll use the short term. We refer to it as Griswold. And what it simply rules that a law in New York, of all places, back in the 50s and 60s, that required age verification in person to buy a pornographic magazine at what we used to call a dirty bookstore is constitutional because the state has a legitimate interest. Even back then, before we have all the research we have now, even back then, people knew the state has an interest in protecting children from accessing pornography in any form. And at that point, at that time and place, the majority of people who consumed pornography consumed it in print form. So we took that case and applied it to the digital world. And what we get, and what the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has affirmed for us, and is now before the Supreme Court, is that online age verification procedures are merely the internet version of in-person age verification procedures, which have always been constitutional to protect kids. That Griswold case is still good law. And it's been put forward to the Supreme Court in a case called Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton out of Texas. And we hope the Supreme Court adopts that framework and upholds these laws. So that's how we balance this. And I think it's really the first, I think the wave of state legislation that you've seen like these laws, 21 states have passed laws like this, including Wyoming. That says strongly to the court and to the entire rest of the country that this probably is very constitutional. I firmly believe it, and I'm really looking forward to what the Supreme Court says.
All right. So, I think people would be shocked to see and to hear like when kids start getting involved in pornography now. I mean, and again, you're right. It was when I was younger, before it was the only way that you can get a hold of pornography was you had to find the man on the street that happened to have one in his house, figure out how to get it. Hopefully it was a friend of yours dad's, and then you would try to steal it and hide it somewhere so that and that was kind of the only way that you could access it at underage. And then when you could drive, find the places that didn't card you the same way you did before when you wanted to drink underage. So you kind of knew those places to go, et cetera. But nowadays, it's fairly simple to access it, at least before age verification, hopefully before age verification goes into effect. So what is the study showing on where children start looking at pornography and pornographic materials?
Yes, so that's really what drove Family Policy Alliance's involvement in this issue originally, Peter. I just want to preface before I go through some of that research that some of it is really shocking. It's not graphic, but it is shocking to your audience, but it's shocking in a good way, in a way that will drive productivity. So here's the bottom line to answer your question. It's safe for people to assume that pretty much every kid, tragically, sadly, regrettably, has been exposed to pornography unintentionally and without their parents' knowledge or consent. I'll say that again. Most kids have been exposed to pornography through technology between the ages of 7 and 13 years old, is what most of the research shows, and without parental knowledge or consent, and unintentionally. So I said 7 and 13 years old. That's the average age of first exposure to pornography. Most kids are exposed in that frame of time. And the research further shows us that most parents have no idea that their kid is being exposed during that time, but don't even know that their kid is being exposed at all, and certainly don't have the opportunity to consent to it or allow it or even guide their kids through it. And by the age of about 17, more than 3/4 of kids have been exposed to it. Now, unique caveat about this research, like most research about pornography, I'm not a psychologist, I'm an attorney, but some of the psychologists and researchers that I have talked to like to give the preface that most research statistics related to pornography exposure and damage and things like that are probably underinflated, because naturally this is not a thing people enjoy talking about. So most of these stats represent people that are simply willing to talk about it. There's probably a substantial statistical boost to these numbers that occurs because people simply are just not willing to admit to it. So that's why I think it's safe to assume most kids, by the time they hit age majority, have been exposed to it. Their parents don't know about it, and that exposure happened all the way back between 7 and 13 years old. The other thing I want to emphasize is that most of these exposures happen unintentionally. And I said in the legislative hearing in Wyoming that they're not looking for the pornography, Peter. The pornography is looking for them.
Right.
That is how the internet works these days. The big pornography companies know it. The big tech companies know it. The apps know it. And all the web browsers know it, which is why these protections are so crucial. Age verification for pornography is the most important first huge step. There are other policies we can pursue to protect kids from the all-out assault, really, against them by the big tech industry. We could talk about that if you want to, but this is the most important first step because it has so much of a lasting impact. And I'll give just a couple more stats. I don't want to drag our whole interview down with this question because there's a lot you could talk about with this. But think about this. We didn't know all this in the 50s and 60s when that Griswold case was being established and that law in New York was being passed. People knew this inherently. And the quote unquote religious right has known this inherently because of what we know God says to us through the Bible. But now we have this vast body of scientific evidence that not only backs up the things we believe, but actually says pornography exposure to anyone, but especially to kids, is way worse than we could possibly imagine. Two pieces of research to back that up. One shows we have the brain scan study funded by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation that shows that pornography has the same impact on the viewer's brain as heroin. They scanned brains, just standard brains. They scanned brains on heroin and brains watching pornography. I'll give you one guess to see which two brains looked literally exactly the same. That is how harmful this is for anyone watching it. What we know about the effects of other addictions and harmful substances is that it's worse on kids the younger they are. The earlier exposed to things like hard drugs, the worse of an impact it has on you. And then finally, there's this rise of sexual violence in our kids that really is fueled by pornography. So most pornography contains either physical abuse or verbal abuse, usually both. And the research shows that kids are watching these depictions, these purported depictions of sexual intimacy, and they're believing that that is what real sex is. And then in their own sex lives, they're going and acting it out on each other. So you have this rise of pediatric sexual assault, which means sexual assault, kids sexually assaulting each other. And the only risk factor for the offenders is an exposure to pornography. That should shock people. So what I want to just conclude this answer with, Peter, is that the inverse of this is why this is so important to pass a bill like this. To protect kids from this has innumerable positive social impacts down the road for them. If their sex lives now are dominated by ideas of abuse within sex and that being enjoyable, then if they are not taught by this, if this no longer becomes sex ed for them, it's going to lead to positive, more healthy sex lives, probably more likely within marriage, less unplanned pregnancies, and healthier romances and less partner abuse. So this is a fine line, and the degradations on either side are just dramatic.
So I'm curious because, I think I know what your answer is going to be here, but it appears to me that part of the problem that we focused on since the 50s and 60s is not the elimination of pornography of age, which is what we've attempted to do, but the elimination of pornography, particularly of hardcore pornography that is creating these problems. We can, we can limit drugs like heroin because of the impact it has on the brain. But if you're going to make that comparison, then why are we battling it at the smaller level, the least common denominator of just our children, instead of battling the pornography as something? Because again, what was considered pornography when, I can't remember this justice that said it, I know it when I know it, that type of, I forgot now the justice and the context. It was in the context of pornography. But now, because of this exposure, because of this stuff, we've allowed it to get to a point where, I personally know of two families who have been destroyed because the father, the adult male, had a porn addiction on it. I know it is the number one addiction among men. It's the number one addiction among Christians. It's the number one addiction among pastors. So when we're looking at all of that, why are we bothering? If we eliminate the top part, then we don't have to worry about age verification. So why is it that it seems like we're just trying to take the low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Peter. And I'm so glad you mentioned those statistics about the church, because that's often what's most shocking for Christians, but most necessary for them to hear, is that this is not an issue where we can claim any kind of moral superiority at this present moment. The addiction rates in and out of the church are exactly the same. And they're even higher among pastors, which, if you know anything about ministry, shouldn't surprise people. The devil, of course, wants to go after God's chosen officers in his army. So I have a lot of sympathy for pastors, and those can be tricky situations, but it's worthwhile enough just for the audience to come to terms with that this has to be dealt with in the house and out of it. But to your question about why we can't protect everyone from this, so I'm not saying we can't. I'm saying it's going to take some time. We were part of the movement, as you read in my bio. Our After Roe campaign was designed to be prepared for the end of the Roe versus Wade decision, the overturning of that. Anyone in the pro-life movement will tell you that took generations. And I'm hopeful that the fight against pornography won't take quite that long. But the reason I think it's going to take a little bit longer to protect everybody from this and not just kids is twofold. One is that Supreme Court precedent. We do have Supreme Court precedent that says that access to pornography, whatever it looks like or whatever it is adults have a protected right of access to it. And there are people like me. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm an attorney, but I know legal scholars and other attorneys who think those cases are wrongly decided. But precedent has a heavy weight in people's minds. This is why it took so long to get Roe overturned, because once it was handed down, it becomes quote unquote precedent. And there are high standards of review for overturning precedent. Now, I do think there's some ways to attack those old decisions, and I think they were wrongly decided. But we have to get there first. And I think if we get this Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton ruling, and it's really as positive as we hope for, I think that will give us a springboard from which to move in through legal academia to start to chip away at some of those older decisions. But I want you to know the advocates like me who are behind this we do eventually want to explore that. Right now, we think it's important to make sure we protect our kids and to make sure every state protects them. And we want to explore that eventually. But the kids are the primary victims right now. And what the research has shown is that if we can protect kids, they'll become healthier adults and really less likely to be addicted to pornography as adults if they're protected while they're kids. Which leads me to the second reason why I think this will be more challenging is you probably heard the phrase, the law is a teacher. I think it was Thomas Aquinas who said politicians, people in the state can use the law to slowly, very, very kindly, graciously lead their population into ethical behavior in certain ways, right? And that means the reverse is true. So if there's a law that doesn't accord with the law of God that is passed, people are more likely to imbibe the ethics behind that. And that really has happened when it comes to pornography. Again, not surprising to me because it's spiritual warfare. The devil wants to get a justification for pornography in every person's mind. And that's why we've seen opposition to these bills on both sides of the aisle. We've also seen support for these bills at both sides of the aisle. I have lots of encouraging stories to tell about that in our work the last few years. But there's opposition to this on both sides of the aisle. Both sides have been conditioned through generations because of these Supreme Court decisions to think adults should be able to do this. It's my free speech right, and it's harmless. What harm could it do to me? Consenting adults, we can do whatever we want. That falls right into the line of our entire sexual ethic, Peter, in my mind, which is we've reduced everything to consent. And I think the pornography addiction, things like epidemic in our society, things like that show the broken promises of that ethic that everything should be reduced to consent. We're finding out the hard way that it's just not that simple.
But alcohol is not the situation. Now, again, I think it's more of a wink, wink, nod, nod when it comes to alcohol, truthfully. I mean, I know of very few college students that if they want to drink, can't find a way of drinking. I think it's, I think the enforcement that's happening is poor at best. But it's a consent thing, but legally they're not allowed to drink until they're 21. And so, but we're like, hey, you still got between 18 and 21. Why do we have the gap for alcohol that we don't for pornography, at least a 3-year gap from 18 to 21, because there is legal precedent for age verification based off the harm it does for others. Again, looking at precedent and looking at that base, it seems like there is an equal amount of precedent to go for that type of age verification, even increase it to 21.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think, or you're aware of my CEO, Craig DeRoche, who has an incredible story of being freed from alcohol addiction. And I think what he would say is that there's some the uniquenesses about alcohol that are different from pornography that made it easier for the United States and the different states to justify the additional enforcement on it, that extra length of time. For the record, in these bills for pornography, they've been form-fitted to whatever the age of majority is in the state that they've been passed. Because not every state has 18 as the age of majority. Some have it as 17, some have it 19, some have it as 21. So it's been form-fitted to that. And I think this is actually an opportunity to highlight the insidiousness of pornography as its impact on you as a person and for the addiction of it. Because one of the striking differences between alcohol and pornography is that a couple of drinks alcohol will impair your driving, for example. It impairs your fine motor skills and it makes you a danger on others. And that impairment increases the younger you get. So most of these laws about alcohol were passed a long time ago. People assumed that as kids' brains develop, they'll become more responsible, a little bit more immune to the effects of alcohol. I know it's kind of funny to think about. But that's what they did the best they could with their time, and more research is showing different things, and there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of lobbying. It's a morass, but there is that striking difference. Whereas if you watch an hour of pornography, sadly, it's unfortunately probably not going to impair your fine motor skills, not dramatically like alcohol will. But I think that's what's insidious about it, Peter, because as I showed you with that research about the brain scans, it's just as bad for you. It's worse for your brain than alcohol, at least in its more reasonable doses. So that has collectively led to pornography being, as you said, the most widespread addiction, I would argue, among men and women. This is a serious problem for women too. We think of it as a men's problem, and it primarily is. But women's addiction rates are very close to men's. I don't want to gloss over that. It makes the addiction, it makes us take the addiction less seriously, and it makes it more socially acceptable. I hate being this blunt about it, Peter, but I like to tell people, just to get the point across, that if you're walking down the streets of New York City It is safe to assume that pretty much every person you walk past has an addiction to pornography at some level. It could be very minor, may not be impacting their life. It also might be dominating their life. But there's not a person you could walk past, at least on the streets of New York or a major city, that isn't struggling with that. That's how widespread this is. So most people who are alcoholics, they're in an AA group, or they're in recovery, they stay in the AA group. We don't have that yet for pornography because it's so socially acceptable. The impacts of it are not as overt on your life as alcohol or drugs. So I think that has given us a scapegoat as a collective for collective action in the public mindset. And I'm hoping that with all this research that we're starting to build up, we will start to see society take pornography as seriously as we take some of these other substances.
So I'm going to ask this question because it's going to end up leading ultimately into the boys and women's sports and the protecting girls in that area. But the problem with internet porn versus a magazine is located within the confines of the state. You know, I can create a porn site here that can go to Wyoming. Wyoming doesn't have any jurisdiction over me. So if I say, well, I'm not going to have, I don't need to have the age verification because of where I happen to be. What are you going to do to me, Wyoming? Absolutely nothing, because I'm not within your state. So when it deals with crossing state lines, it seems like it kind of muddies the water a little bit, at least on the enforcement mechanism on it. So how does that get addressed? And then I'm going to tie that into what my question was for women's sports as well.
Yeah, I don't want us to lose that thread, so I'll be brief on this. It's a good question, and intuitively, that I think that makes sense. But the reality is also that states have an obligation to honor each other's laws. And there's also business law that shows that if you make your business available to people in another state that your business isn't incorporated in, then you're liable for the harms that happen in that other state. It's the same with the internet. So if the largest supplier of pornography in the world online is Pornhub, it's the largest supplier in the world, period, of any substance, because pornography comes in book form, comes in audio form, and it comes in video form, which is the most popular. Pornhub is the biggest provider of Pornhub in the world. They're one of the most nefarious actors in the world, period. They make their business available in all of these states. They're not incorporated here. They're incorporated in Canada. Well, through these laws, we can still hold them accountable because they are making their business available here. And I'll give an example of this so to get the point across, and then we can talk about women's spaces. Is in 20 of the 21 states that have passed these laws, Peter, Pornhub has actually removed their business from the state. If you try to log on to Pornhub, I live in Virginia, right? Virginia passed one of these laws 2 years ago in a bipartisan fashion, by the way, split legislature. Pornhub now removed their business from the state of Virginia as a protest to these laws. If you try to log on to Pornhub, you'll get a message from some porn star saying how terrible this bill, House bill, whatever is, and you should call your legislature and tell them to vote to repeal it. And what they're demonstrating there, Peter, is their business ethic. They know how dependent they are on underage audiences, and they believe as a moral imperative that children should be able to access pornography as young as possible, and they should be able to do it without parental knowledge or consent. They think that is an affirmative moral good. That is the statement they are making. If adults can't have, if kids can't have porn, nobody can have porn. They could comply with these laws easily. But they have chosen as a protest to remove their entire business from the state, which, I'll take it as a policy objective. That was more than I ever hoped to achieve, but that is revealing for them. And it shows why this enforcement mechanism will still work. They know they're liable in these states. They know these laws can subject them to that. And so I would just encourage people, this is why your state needs a law and every state needs the law. We're almost halfway there. We're going to keep working until we get it.
So the reason why I say that ties in, because when we're talking about men playing women's sports, which to me, again, that's low hanging fruit. We could talk about that all day long, and you and I will agree, and everybody I think that listens to this podcast will agree, unless I think they're quite dumb, especially if they have a girl. I have a daughter who played sports. It would be dumb, and a son. So, but here's part of the question I have. Again, when you're dealing with a state that does it, like, again, the state of Wyoming, they said, okay, you can't do it. But sports too often cross state lines. Travel ball, when it comes to the high school level, travel ball crosses state lines all the time. When you move to the collegiate level, obviously that's going to happen. So either So does that mean that Wyoming says, okay, if you come from the state of Colorado, and now all of a sudden that person can't play for us because of our law, but then what happens when Wyoming goes to Colorado to play something from there? There again seems to be some execution problems with this until we can get all 50 states to agree that this is a bad idea.
Hmm. I agree with that to a large extent. That's why it was so important, A, for President Trump to sign an executive order attempting to disincentivize this as strongly as he's able to as the executive. And that's why it's also important for the federal government to finally pass a bill that saves girls' sports. There have been opportunities for that. They had a vote earlier this year. Unfortunately, all members of one party voted against it. That was disappointing, including female members in their caucus. So we agree with you. We're at 25 states that have passed Save Girls Sports laws with the passage of the Riley Gaines Act in Georgia. So we're not going to stop till every state has this. But in the meantime, the reason this is so important is because every female athlete in your state, in the state of Wyoming, has always deserved these protections. Always has. This is such a brand new problem, Peter, that Title IX was passed and written in the 60s during the civil rights era. A concept of gender identity was just being come up with. Historically speaking, the transgender ideology is about 5 minutes old. And so the idea that girls should ever have had to face this challenge is wrong and unjust from the start. That's why this is a women's civil rights issue. So I think if we apply a civil rights context to this, that becomes more illuminating, because it means even if certain states are not ready to apply civil rights to certain groups, as we did see during the civil rights movement for African Americans in our country, that doesn't mean other states shouldn't take the stand to uphold civil rights in their state. And it can put pressure on those other, I would argue, backwards states that haven't come to terms with the need for this civil rights yet to finally do it. And we've really seen that. We've seen the parties that oppose this, the groups of politicians that oppose this very common sense measure, get hammered for it, both in the polls, in the media, and best of all, at the ballot box. So I do want to, because of all that, I want to give a shout out to Wyoming Family Alliance, which is the group that really took the lead in passing this law and the age verification law on the ground. They're part of a network of state family policy councils that FPA allies with in the states. There's about 40 of them. We want one in every state eventually. Wyoming Family Alliance, led by Nathan Winters and his great team there, they were the primary on-the-ground legislative advocates as lobbyists for this bill and for others. And particularly for the last bill, too, age verification for pornography, I got the privilege of working really closely with them. And the great sponsor of that bill, Representative Martha Lawley, I mean, they understand all these things that we're talking about. They know it, and they take it fearlessly into the Wyoming State House. So I just wanted to thank them for that, if you don't mind, Peter. And
No, I
hopefully
don't
that
mind.
shows the importance of why we need this.
Yeah, so again, and we're getting kind of toward the end of time, and so I guess the question now is, people are listening to this obviously in multiple different states. Some states are very conservative with it. Some states have already passed similar legislation, but others haven't. Where do people who aren't lawyers, where do people who are just, they're cooks in a restaurant. They work in retail stores. They're car salespeople. How do they help institute something like this? Where do they do it? Because again, voting in the ballot box and people getting blasted and like losing really badly doesn't seem to be having a tremendous amount of effect, because you're right, that whole party said, hey, I'm staying away, I'm going to vote this way no matter what party lines. It doesn't matter whether or not I have a daughter. It doesn't matter whether or not I'm a woman that played in sports. How do we get involved to push that harder than just hoping for the next election cycle goes our way?
Oh, the best question, my favorite question, Peter. So thank you. How can people get involved to make a difference here? That's something that FPA and our Alliance of State Family Policy Councils really specializes in. So does our sister ministry, by the way, which is called Christians Engaged. Their objective is to mobilize 1 million Christians across the country every year to get involved in the civil process, which most people, when they hear that, think that means voting. Yes, it does mean voting, but it means so much more. All of your listeners, not a single one of them should ever doubt the impact that they can have individually, not just in the country, not just in their state, but especially above all in their local community. The laws that most govern their lives are done at the local level in their communities, in their state houses. And I would encourage people to get involved in those ways. We have training programs to help people do that. If you go onto our website, fpaf.com, we have things like the Social Conservative Academy and the School Board Academy, which can train people to get involved in these local bodies. And it's the school boards that I would really consider people to look into for if they want to make a difference on this area, actually on both these areas, really, Peter, because local school boards have wide latitude to make determinations about who can play on which sports teams, who can use which facilities, sex segregated facilities like bathrooms and locker rooms. School boards can make their own rules, and maybe it means they have a fight with their overall state over it. But those fights have been going our way for a while, and people should be encouraged by that. And it's much easier to impact that at their local level, and it will protect their people there locally who they care about. So I would encourage people to get involved locally at the school board level, because you can also impact that exposure to pornography. A lot of this exposure happens, unfortunately, during school time on cell phones or on
Right.
library computers, or also with print materials in libraries that are just content inappropriate for children. Parents locally and school boards representing them have the right to decide which materials are available to kids in their school libraries. That is part of a parental authority and local authority. They can do that. It's not book banning. It's simply determining, are these materials safe and appropriate, age appropriate for their kids. So I would encourage people, it's your local communities that drive these waves of state legislation and force the issue. Don't underestimate the impact you can have there. And if you want some help with this, if you want a cheat code for it, I would just encourage you, wherever state you're in, get involved with your state family policy council. You can find them all on our website. It's fpaf.com/allies. That's where you'll find a page of every FPC, we call them, in the country. Get involved. They're eager to hear from you and to help make your voice heard.
And that's very important. I mean, and we'll definitely put that in the show notes below as well. And you also host a podcast, I know, where you deal with a lot of this stuff as well, the House to Home podcast. You can find it, I'm assuming, at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the normal places.
Yep, you can
Good.
find them all there. You'll get clips and links to them on our social media as well, which you can find on our website. So the podcast is relatively young, Peter. I'm not as experienced or have as much of a track record at this as you do, but we're trying to get there. We're a few weeks into it, and I have a great co-host in Grace Youngson, and we just take one pro-family policy story every week and talk about it for about 20 minutes to inform people. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good. Well, I encourage people to go and listen to that as well. So, well, Joseph, thank you so much. I appreciate you being on the show. This is a topic that is very near to my heart, and both of these are. So I appreciate you helping get this word out and talking to people about it, and for fighting for it, not just complaining about it behind a meme. So I appreciate all the work you're doing on this.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thanks for the chance to talk about it, and just for all your time and trusting me with your platform. It was an honor to be here.
Well, thank you again. I appreciate it. God bless you.